Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a story that has deep roots all across the United States, but has a special meaning for Seattle. So it's a lot of fun for me to be here. And the fact that both of my books have Seattle exhibits this week is particularly fun. So what I'd like to do is just introduce the book by reading the first couple of pages from the prologue, in which I land on planet Earp. Did you know that Wyatt Earp was buried in a Jewish cemetery? Just hearing his name threw me back to my childhood in Jackson Heights, New York City, sprawled on the floor in front of a black and white television watching Westerns with my big brother Joey, dressed up in his special shirt with braided trim and snazzy snap buttons and black cowboy hat and shiny gun and a faux leather holster slung around his hips. Joey and I tuned in and pretended to walk the streets of Tombstone every week together with millions of Americans, young and old. Joey was my hero, and Marshall Earp was his. Brave, courageous, bold, and Jewish. Jewish? That's how it all started, just an innocent question from a friend who thought, correctly, that I would be intrigued by the incongruities between anything Jewish and anything Tombstone-ish. This first burst of curiosity about Wyatt Earp's final resting place and religion was easily satisfied. I soon learned that Wyatt, the only man to emerge unscathed from the gunfight at the OK Corral, was not Jewish, but had lived with a Jewish woman for nearly 50 years. And she buried him next to her parents and brother in a family plot at the synagogue-affiliated Hills of Eternity Cemetery outside of San Francisco. And that was my introduction to Mrs. Earp. As children, when Wyatt Earp ruled the airwaves, we didn't know that he had a wife, certainly not a Jewish wife from New York. I was a Jew from New York. So each revelation about a woman named Josephine Marcus evoked new images that made me smile, especially the thought of Wyatt Earp going home for chicken soup after a tough day fighting for truth and justice in the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona. But I quickly became far more interested in Mrs. Earp than in her famous husband. Contradictions piled up like a freeway collision. How had a beautiful girl from San Francisco via New York and Prussia ended up in Tombstone, while the rest of her immigrant family climbed out of poverty and into bourgeois respectability? Why had Josephine run away? What inspired 5 decades of adventure seeking that took her from the Arizona territory to California, Nevada, Alaska, and then finally to Hollywood? Okay, so that's how the book begins. And now you have the headline: Writer discovers that Wyatt Earp is buried in a Jewish cemetery, which actually sounds much more like a parody of something you'd read in The Onion than something real. Now let's see if I've got my clicker here. Voila! And there's my brother Joey. And I'm the little thing in the crib. Aren't I cute? That was a true story. But when I came to this as an adult, what really fascinated me was that the early books about Wyatt never mentioned that there had been any Mrs. Earps. In fact, if you read some of those early Western books, it's as if there were no women at all, as if these men had no mothers or wives or daughters. And we just didn't hear anything about them. So imagine if you were to write a biography of Ronald Reagan without ever mentioning Nancy, or Bill Clinton without Hillary, just to cover both sides of the aisle. So this struck me as pretty amazing, and it's what led me to, I'll eventually figure this out, to the real Mrs. Earp. Okay. No. I may need somebody to click for me. Clicker. I actually heard that in the early days of television, Bill Paley had someone come and visit him, and he said he needed to change the channel. and someone said, "What, don't you have a remote control?" And he said, "Sure I do. George!" And George came and changed the channel. So could you teach me, George, how to, it's really Elliot. So what am I doing wrong? Can you get it? Oh, good, it's not just me. I'm usually pretty good with technology. Okay, so I'll just keep going. And I'm gonna start by telling you a little bit about her family in the United States. So Josephine's parents emigrated from Prussia around 1850. And this was a pretty familiar story of Jewish immigration. But for the rest of her life, Josephine would say that her family was German, not Prussian. And that's a very important distinction. Prussia is now Poland. And did it really matter? Well, it didn't really matter, except that the German Jews tended to be more affluent, better educated, less religious. The Prussian Jews, i.e. the Eastern European Jews, were much more religious and less affluent and spoke Yiddish rather than rather than German. So it was actually an important distinction. Oh, there we go. So there's a circle around Posen, which is the place that her family was from. And coincidentally, you see Silesia right below that? That's actually where my mother is from. So even though I thought I had strayed so far from the story of my mother, when I dipped into the American frontier, in fact, I really wasn't that far away. So this is a picture of steamers arriving in San Francisco, and that's how Josephine's family arrived in San Francisco around 1870. They had spent about 10 years, a little bit more, in New York. They had been in New York during the Civil War, but the family had not succeeded financially. And if you were in New York during those years, you would be reading in the newspapers constantly about the wonders of San Francisco. Come to San Francisco, everything is terrific there. And so the Marcus family, which wasn't doing particularly well on the Lower East Side of New York, decided that they would take a second immigration hop and went from New York and then traveled down south, went through the Isthmus of Panama, and then via steamer up to San Francisco. And when they arrived in San Francisco, the San Francisco of that time was, in fact, the growing, thriving community that they had thought it would be. But like New York, it was a highly stratified Jewish society where the German Jews were the upper class, and everyone else, especially the Polish Jews, were at the bottom. And this fellow that you see here on the right, his name is Isaac Benjamin, and a lot of what I eventually came to understand as Josephine's motivation for leaving San Francisco was seeing the German Jewish divide through his eyes. He had lived in the United States for 3 years and had observed the remarkable intolerance from the German Jewish community to some of the other parts of the Jewish community. And so in that divide between the German Jews and the non-German Jews, to me lies the secret of Josephine's first running away from home. She was a teenager. She didn't want to be second class. She was a party girl. She was pretty outgoing, vivacious. And the thought that because of her family's origins and the way that they spoke, that somehow she wouldn't go to the right schools or the right parties, that seemed outrageous to her. So like Huckleberry Finn, Josephine lit out for the territories. Now, when she ran away from home, she was about 18 years old, and she ran away to join an acting troupe. The pinafore craze was sweeping the United States. It's sort of hard to explain how important this was at the time, but when Gilbert and Sullivan first wrote HMS Pinafore and then it came to the United States, every town had a pinafore troupe. There was pinafore performed in German and Italian and in every language you can think of, and they were so desperate for actors that they went right into the local amateur schools and took actors right out of them, including someone like Josephine, who wasn't enormously talented, but she could dance the hornpipe. So Josephine went